Okay, welcome to the Scotonomics Festival of Economics, the Leith iteration. So, hello everyone. If you don't know me, I'm Karen Van Sweden and I'm an Aberdeen City Councillor and I'm also co-host of Scotonomics. So, over to you, William.
Hello, thanks everyone for joining us tonight. I'd like to introduce you to Professor Brett Christophers.
I've got the rest of the introduction. So, few people know more about the UK economy really than Professor Brett Christophers. So we are delighted that Professor Christophers is here to open our 2025 Festival of Economics. Brett was born in Croydon, but we've just discovered his nan was from Leith. What about that? Yeah. He's currently working at Uppsala University in Sweden. Yet, Professor Christophers just can't stop writing about the UK, even when he's set out to write about the USA. So, whilst researching his 2020 book, Rentier Capitalism, Brett was sure that the US had to be the most capitalist nation. But after a little bit of research, all reading roads led to the UK winning that title. In Rentier Capitalism, Brett wrote, the UK has come to be seen as the world's undisputed privatisation trailblazer. So, then in 2023, our lives in their portfolios, Professor Christophers explains how BlackRock not only owns your home, it also owns the land from which your food originates, the wind farm that generates your electricity, the road you drive to work on, and much of else besides. So, it seems our lives almost depend on BlackRock, as it often decides to commercialise those various proprietary real assets. In his 2025 book, The Price is Wrong, Brett discusses the UK electricity market and asks, why does the most expensive generator set the price for all? A good question indeed, which elicited much head scratching and at the time of the writing. So, well, tonight we're going to set out the answer to the question and other head scratchers. Can you give Professor Christophers a big round of applause?
So actually, this is a good place to go back to where we started, which is the term rent is a term that gets used in all sorts of different ways by different types of economists, and if you're talking within the kind of mainstream orthodox economic tradition, rent is basically understood as a kind of an excess form of profit. So if average profit or normal profit is the level of profitability that is achievable in a competitive market, then for mainstream economists, rent is the excess profit that is available by virtue of a lack of competition, essentially. So it's the excess associated with a degree of monopoly power in certain markets. So that's how mainstream economists understand rent. Within the kind of heterodox tradition, rent is understood somewhat differently, and that's the way I understand it, is where it's basically rent is a form of income which is attainable by virtue of the fact that you have ownership or control of some kind of scarce asset. Housing or land is the classic asset on which you can earn rents by virtue of the fact that you own the house. Other people want to pay you to use that house. And the basic argument of that book, of Rentier Capitalism, is that in today's economy, housing and land are not the only types of assets where you can earn significant levels of income of that type by virtue of having control or ownership of those types of assets. So we can think of financial assets in that way. We can think of intellectual property in that way, so patents, trademarks, copyrights, those types of things. They are scarce assets, and having control of those assets, like the patent to a particularly important pharmaceutical product, like a COVID vaccine, entitles you to earn a certain level of income, not by virtue of necessarily doing anything, but simply by virtue of the fact that you own that property, an intellectual property in that sense, that prevents other people from making that particular medicine. Natural resources, so oil and gas assets, rare earth minerals, infrastructures, owning the water or wastewater networks that enable you to deliver certain services. All of those types of things are scarce assets that enable you to earn income simply by virtue of the fact that you control and own those assets. So that's what heterodox economists understand of rent. And so the argument about rentier capitalism is not that we are like now in a new form of capitalism where previously it was a different form of capitalism and now it's rentier capitalism. The basic argument that I try and make is that there's always been rents within capitalism. There have always been rentiers, there's always been landlords. But today, and particularly in the UK case, rent as a form of income and rentiers, by which I mean economic actors who are concentrated on controlling assets, earning income of that type, is disproportionately more important than it has been in the past. And the book is about trying to identify those different sectors of the economy within which rents are particularly important. So finance, again, natural resources, land and housing, infrastructure, pharmaceuticals, so on and so forth. But B, trying to explain why it is that, particularly since the 1970s, the UK has become what a Financial Times journalist called a rentier's paradise. A great place to be a rentier, what it is that has made the UK this rentier's paradise.
And this is attractive for other organisations in other countries to own the asset here,
100%,
and sweat the asset and earn more than most other nations.
Exactly. And so the book, that's one of the things. So the two main things it tries to do is think about what it is about, like why it's been so propitious for rentiers to operate in the UK in the last few decades, and B, what some of the implications of that are for the country as a whole.
Fantastic. Well, we've got 15 minutes left, and I want to...
is that all we have left?
Yeah,
Okay.
that's all we've got. And I want to concentrate now on renewables.
Okay.
We had a really great conversation, and I'll put it up next week, and we went into this in a little bit of detail, the interview we had for The National. I suppose the most important question I want to get from you, your opinion, is that we were told back in 2000, it was Alex Salmond, I think it was about 2005, who said that Scotland could be, or would be the Saudi Arabia of renewables. And he repeated that a few times, and it seems to be something that's fairly consistent within the Scottish government now, that, I don't want to kind of paraphrase, but renewables are the kind of solution to our problems as a nation now, but certainly would be a big part of the solution to our economic problems as an independent nation. So could you just talk to, first of all, could Scotland be the Saudi Arabia of renewables, and is that necessarily a really good thing?
Well, I guess the presumably I don't know that particular discourse coming out of Scotland, and particularly from Salmond particularly well, but I would imagine that part of the rationale for that argument is obviously the historic role of the oil and gas sector in Scotland, and the idea that given the climate crisis, that there must be an end point, preferably sooner rather than later, for hydrocarbon production, not just in Scotland, obviously, but internationally. And the idea, I think, would be that if you want to remain within the energy sector, an expertise, a speciality within the energy sector, then that would be almost a natural transition from oil and gas to renewables. Certainly in the case of offshore wind, there are certain skill sets that are pretty similar there in terms of operating major infrastructure offshore. So that would be part of it. I mean, I would say that there are at least two very good reasons to be sceptical about that argument. The first of those is that Saudi Arabia is able to make a lot of money from oil and gas in large part because it exports that oil and gas. Now, renewable electricity you can export it if there are interconnectors available to connect you to international markets, but it's a heck of a lot harder to export than oil and gas are.
And you need that infrastructure if you haven't got it.
And that infrastructure is incredibly expensive, and renewables generators, they're not going to undertake the investment in those interconnection capacities themselves. It has to be kind of a public investment.
Yeah. At the moment, just to clarify, do we have any of these connectors to the rest of Europe from Scotland at the moment? No. So this would need a big infrastructure investment by the state.
Incredibly expensive. So first of all, it's much harder to export and therefore monetize than oil and gas are. And then the other one, and this is kind of what my book is mainly about, is that like it or not, the reality is that the renewables business, irrespective of questions of export, is just a much less profitable business than oil and gas are. There's people don't like to admit it, particularly politicians, particularly in places like Scotland, but there is just not that much money to be made in renewables. It's a low profit business.
I think you said like 5%, didn't you?
Average returns are somewhere between 5 to 7%, whereas the BPs and the Shells don't get out of bed for new oil and gas projects unless the expected returns are well in excess of 15%. So the level of profitability is just much, much lower in the renewables business. So the idea that you're going to build a long-term national business model around it is pretty far-fetched.
Okay, I'd like to see a wee bit of feedback on that, because that's not an argument that we hear enough, I think, when we're talking about the role of renewables. So is there anyone who's willing to kind of push back on that for me and Brett? You've both asked questions. I will come to you if no one else wants to. Does anyone else want to ask a question or make a comment? Okay, great, I'll go to you first, sir.
I was just wondering about water. I mean, Scotland's pretty wet and the south of England's pretty dry, so can't we just sell water?
Well, yeah, I've got a deep moral issue with us selling water, but I'm sure there's a lot of other people who wouldn't come at it from that.
One thing that's very interesting about water in Scotland, just aside from the copious amounts of it, is the fact that Scottish Water is publicly owned, right? Which fundamentally distinguishes Scotland from England and Wales, where all water has been privatised. And to my mind, it's not coincidental that, at least as far as everything I've seen, or maybe other people have better knowledge than me, but on most reasonable metrics in terms of pricing, in terms of kind of investment in infrastructure, outcomes have been superior in Scotland, specifically in the water sector, than in almost any part of the UK. And I think it has absolutely to do with public ownership, which is not to say Scottish Water has always been a perfect operator. I'm sure it hasn't, but I think that there's a really interesting story there around public ownership that absolutely distinguishes Scotland from, which is not true in electricity and gas, but it is true in water.
Simon?
Just to come back on the renewables being less profitable, isn't the solution to go up the value chain? So you use that energy to do something locally, perhaps a data centre or something like that can make you money.
That argument is often made. So here just to give people some context to your question. So one of the other things about renewable electricity is that not only is profitability quite low historically, but it's also very, very volatile. Principally because the types of markets in which electricity is sold, pricing in those markets is itself very, very volatile. And so historically, the only way that you've been able to get a new renewables project developed, and in particular financed, is through having some type of extrinsic mechanism that provides long-term price stability. And the main way in which that has happened historically is that the government comes in and basically says, we, the government, either directly through like a publicly owned utility or indirectly, will guarantee you, the renewables developer, a fixed price for your electricity over the, say, next 12 to 15 years. And the classic mechanism they've done that is through what's called a feed-in tariff. So basically the government guarantees a fixed price, and the developer can then go to banks and say, look, I've been guaranteed this fixed price for my electricity, now you can have the confidence to lend me the money to develop the project. And as you indicate, what's happening increasingly now is that an Amazon or a Google or a Microsoft essentially plays the same role as the government, because they'll say, we've got this very, very data hungry AI business, so we will buy your electricity for the next 12 to 15 years and we'll pay you a fixed price for it. And that promise from an Amazon serves exactly the same functional purpose as the promise from the government has historically done in terms of enabling the renewables developer like Scottish Power to finance the project in the first place. Now, the problem with that is that the Amazons and so on, they don't offer better electricity, they don't offer the developer better prices than governments do. If you think about this, going back to where we started in terms of power, all the power tends to be in that negotiation, tends to be on the side of Amazon rather than the renewables developer. There are countless renewables developers trying to get new projects off the ground, but there's only a limited number of Amazons and Microsofts and new data centers being built. So in terms of the negotiating leverage, all the power in those negotiations tends to be with the Amazons. And so they're able to push down the prices that they pay to those developers, which depresses the profitability available. So lots of politicians see that as kind of a magic bullet for getting new renewables developed. Oh, AI is going, but in practice it doesn't. In practice it doesn't turn out like that.
I think the principle's there, though. If you've got a lot of electricity, you want industry or households to be using that electricity or that energy that's there. That's a way that you make the most of it rather than trying to sell it.
Yeah. I think the other thing about renewables to understand as well is that right now, partly because of those limited interconnectors to other places from Scotland, much more renewable electricity is generated in Scotland than can be consumed at the moment, and that's another huge cost of public subsidy. So something like 300 or 400 million pounds gets paid each year to renewables generators for electricity that they produce but which can't be sold. So any power that gets curtailed is the terminology for it. They get remunerated for, even if it's actually if it's discarded. So in a sense, right now, there is no scope to actually take more renewable power in Scotland because it can't be consumed.
There's not too much energy. There's not enough infrastructure. Is how I would address it. We've got a question at the back.
Hi there. Thanks so much for it. It's been really fascinating. This is it's a linked question. And it's about how you know that large-scale facilities must be a priority for renewables to have a long-term transformative impact on planetary health. But you also emphasise that any sensible and flexible energy future, that there must be a place for distributed generation, so small-scale generation of electricity. So I'm just wondering what policy or legislative levers we need to create that right balance, and what that right balance.
It's a really good question. It's a really complex question. So just for people in the room who aren't necessarily aware of exactly what you're talking about. So as well as having kind of big power plants, whether they're based on fossil fuels or whether they're solar or wind farms that generate electricity and then sell it to the grid to be transmitted and distributed to the grid and sold to households, you can have distributed energy, which is like rooftop solar or on households or community-owned wind turbines or whatever else it might be. And the point is that like a mixed ecology would have both of those things. I'd say the answer to that depends very much where in the world you're talking about. So in a place like the UK, we have a historically developed centralized grid system that we are kind of stuck with, and that we, in a sense, which makes the development of the future energy landscape very path dependent. It's shaped by that grid. Now, the problem you have with things like distributed energy is the problem of what's called grid defection, where if in a sense, the more households you have generating their own electricity and potentially going off grid, then the costs of the grid have to get amortized or shared across a declining number of households. And so that can be a real, and places like Australia are really struggling with that now, with lots and lots of homes going off grid, because the grid still needs to be paid for by someone. And so in a sense you don't want people going off grid, because it's the classic social resource, right? Electricity, I think Lenin had a great line about electricity being like the great social resource. But it's very, very different in parts of the world that don't have that historic investment in a centralised grid system, like parts of Africa, for example. And there, I think the potential to kind of almost bypass that centralised grid-based system is actually much greater than it is in this part of the world, where we do have that grid and we're kind of, in a way, stuck with it. But it's a great resource, but we need to... So the point, I think, in this part of the world is yes, but there needs to be very careful thinking about how distributed energy gets encouraged and mobilised, but not in a way that kind of jeopardises the role of the grid and the cost-sharing mechanisms that are central to that grid as a national resource.
Or comment at the back there, yep.
Brett, how would you define a rent seeker? Because in your book, in Infrastructure Rent Seekers thing, there's a thing you're saying that lax regulation is a sign that rent seeking is persistent over the time. But would you define what those water utilities are doing when they're not investing and they're skimming lots of profits? Would you define that as rent seeking as well?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, that term, I don't really use that term, because it's a term that has been sort of almost captured by political science in terms of thinking about...
bastardised by public choice academics.
Exactly, yeah. But if you ignore that tradition, then absolutely, I think kind of trying to monopolise rent generating assets and limit the ways in which the ability of those assets to generate recurring predictable incomes can be encroached upon either by competition or by more onerous taxation on assets and capital gains and so on. All of that for me would come under the title of rent seeking.
From reading the book, I would also add to that and say that it seems like so much of the rent that's earned now never used to be available 30, 40 years ago. It was public ownership.
Yeah, absolutely.
And now it's the selling of those assets. And you talk about apartment blocks in Germany, that were run Eastern, communist apartment blocks. All of a sudden they appear on the international market, and that money needs something, so it's finding the resources. And
yeah.
I think the state is happy to take those things off the balance sheet and give them to private, and that's where I think that's where the majority of these rents seem to be coming from. The state just giving away those assets.
There's a problem that the price of electricity appears to be very closely linked under the current electricity market to the price of gas.
It is.
What would you do? And I understand the Treasury and others are very reluctant to change that at all.
Yeah.
What would you do?
Fantastic. And then I'll take that question or that comment from the lady, and then we'll be finished. Yes.
I was going to ask, do you think part of the reason that the UK has such a strong rentier capitalism is that we don't have enough regulation to protect the common good and to ensure businesses operate to some extent in the common good? Because I get the impression that perhaps in the rest of Europe they do have that as a bigger factor.
Yeah, those are two great questions that I could go on.
Yeah.
So to take the latter one first, I think so. Here's I think a good way to understand this is that so when a lot of the assets that have been privatised in the UK, particularly utilities, so water, electricity, gas, railways and so on, when they were privatised, it was recognised that in a lot of those areas it was almost impossible to introduce meaningful competition, because you were talking about kind of natural monopoly networks where it would be mad to kind of have two sets of pipes leading to home or two sets of railways going in exactly. So the idea was that regulation would kind of stand in for competition. Regulation would kind of keep capitalists honest in a sense. And I think that it's pretty clear that has failed for all sorts of different reasons. You know, partly because regulators get captured, partly because you know, the entities themselves end up writing the regulation a lot of the time. So all sorts of different reasons. But I also think partly because there's this kind of myth that you can have such a thing as corporate social responsibility, where those actors will kind of almost regulate themselves out of some kind of social mission, which to my mind is a complete nonsense. I think government regulation should always work from the premise that capitalists will try to get away with whatever they can get away with in the service of generating shareholder value, and so therefore you basically assume the worst and then regulate accordingly. And that's not what's happened in the UK. There's this kind of myth of corporate social responsibility, which is a complete nonsense. So I think we failed fundamentally on regulation. On the electricity pricing question. So yes, for all sorts of complicated reasons, the price of electricity in the UK very closely tracks the price of natural gas. So one answer to that is you decouple them, and during the energy crisis, that's what everyone was talking about. And then as soon as prices kind of subsided, all the talk about decoupling disappeared. But there's a very good reason for that, which is that the renewables developers want those prices to remain coupled, because that coupling keeps electricity prices high, and the promise of high electricity prices represents a promise of potentially high profits. And so if you decouple them, electricity prices go down, and the incentive to invest in new renewables diminishes accordingly. And so I think that is representative of a broader problem, which is that on the one hand, governments like the UK government, like the UK's, are on the one hand they are saying we're going to facilitate an energy transition, but we're going to do that while keeping household energy bills as low as possible. Very noble and laudable motive. But on the other hand, they're saying it's going to be led by the private sector. And it's like, well, but that requires a certain promise of high profitability for the private sector to want to invest in the first place. And those two things are fundamentally incompatible with one another. So the government is constantly caught between this rock and this hard place of wanting profitability for renewables generation to be sufficiently high to incentivise investment, but for that renewable electricity to be delivered at such a cost that will keep household energy bills low. And those two things are in fundamental tension with one another, so the government really finds itself kind of grappling with trying to thread the needle between two fundamentally inconsistent aims. And to my mind, the only real answer to it is public ownership of renewable energy. But right now, that feels so politically far-fetched, precisely because of where we were talking about what William was talking about earlier, in terms of the government's complete unwillingness to contemplate, fiscal expansionism. If it's all about fiscal conservatism and kind of not borrowing, not putting stuff on the public balance sheet, you're completely reliant on the private sector to undertake that investment.
Great, and that was raised in in Holyrood just last week when the minister said we'll look at zonal pricing, and that might be good for customers, and there's been some research on that, but that'll also be bad for renewable investment, and that's a problem. And I think it comes quite clearly, but right at the end of your book, when you say it looks like state ownership has to play much more of a bigger role position. So I just want to say I've loved interviewing you. Thanks very much, Brett.
Thank you.